The biggest mistakes are usually made by people who think no one will ever check the paperwork. That thought kept replaying in my mind the morning I walked toward the back of my family's property and realized something was terribly wrong. My name is Ethan Walker, and my family has owned 143 acres of timberland in northern Georgia for 3 generations. Every fence post, every creek, every stand of oak and pine had a story attached to it because my grandfather believed a piece of land was only truly yours if you knew every inch of it. That morning, the birds were unusually quiet. Instead of hearing woodpeckers tapping in the distance, I heard engines shutting down somewhere beyond the tree line. As I rounded the bend near an old stone fence, I stopped so suddenly that I almost dropped my coffee. An entire section of mature timber was gone. Massive white oak and pine trees that had stood there longer than I'd been alive had disappeared, leaving fresh stumps spread across the hillside. Tire tracks cut through the damp ground, and neat piles of branches showed whoever had done this hadn't rushed. They had worked confidently, as if they believed they belonged there. My first instinct was anger, but years of managing land had taught me something more valuable than losing my temper. Before asking questions, collect facts. I pulled out my phone and began recording everything. I filmed every stump, every track, every boundary marker, and every orange survey pin that still stood exactly where the county surveyor had placed them years earlier. Those markers weren't close to the property line. They were hundreds of feet inside my land. That detail immediately told me this wasn't a simple mistake. While I was documenting the damage, one of my neighbors slowed his pickup truck beside the fence. He hesitated before speaking. "You weren't here yesterday," he said quietly. "There were trucks from the HOA. They said they had authorization." I looked at him, waiting for him to laugh and admit he was joking, but he never did. Our property wasn't part of any homeowners association. My land had always remained outside the subdivision that bordered my eastern fence. I thanked him, climbed into my truck, and drove directly to the subdivision entrance. HOA President Patricia Reynolds was already standing near the clubhouse speaking with a landscaping contractor. She greeted me with the kind of polite smile people use when they believe every decision has already been made. I asked one simple question. "Who authorized cutting trees on my property?" She didn't hesitate. She calmly replied that the wooded area was considered common space according to HOA records and that hazardous trees had been removed for community safety. She even sounded surprised that I was questioning it. I didn't argue. Instead, I asked if she could provide the documents supporting that claim. Her smile faded for the first time. She said the management office had maps proving everything. I simply nodded, thanked her, and walked away. She probably expected an emotional confrontation. Instead, I drove to the county records office to request certified copies of my deed and survey. Before leaving the subdivision, however, something caught my attention. One of the contractors was loading his equipment onto a trailer, and folded across the passenger seat of his truck was a large printed map bearing the HOA logo. Even from several yards away, I could tell the property boundary drawn on that map didn't match the orange survey markers still standing deep inside my timber. At that moment, I realized this wasn't just about trees anymore. Somewhere, 2 completely different versions of the same property existed, and in 9 days the county would conduct a boundary verification that could determine which version everyone would be forced to believe. The county records office had always been one of my favorite places because facts did not care about opinions. Shelves full of deeds, plats, surveys, and easements had settled more arguments than any courtroom ever could. I requested certified copies of my property deed, the original survey recorded when my grandfather expanded the farm, and every document connected to the eastern boundary. The clerk, a middle-aged man named Michael Jensen, recognized my family name almost immediately. He disappeared into the archive room and returned carrying a thick folder that looked exactly as I remembered from years earlier. Everything matched my memory. The legal description, the bearings, the distances, and every survey monument placed along the boundary confirmed the timber stood well inside my property. Before handing the documents back, Michael paused and asked an unexpected question. He said, "Did someone recently ask to review your property file?" I looked at him in surprise because I had not authorized anyone to do that. He explained that about 3 weeks earlier someone representing a local homeowners association had requested copies of several historical boundary documents. The request itself was public record, but he could not discuss anything further without another formal request. That single piece of information changed how I viewed the entire situation. This had not been a sudden misunderstanding. Someone had been researching my land before the trees were ever removed. I thanked him, requested certified copies of every available survey, and drove straight home. Instead of confronting Patricia again, I spread every document across my dining room table beside the photographs I had taken that morning. Then I remembered the printed map I had seen inside the contractor's truck. It looked cleaner than any county survey, almost like a marketing illustration instead of a legal document. There had to be a reason for that difference. The following afternoon I attended the Homeowners Association office during its regular business hours and politely requested a copy of the community boundary map. Patricia welcomed me with the same calm confidence she had shown the previous day. She slid a laminated map across the conference table and pointed directly at the wooded section behind my eastern fence. According to that document, nearly 20 acres of my family's timber were labeled as common green space maintained by the association. I kept my expression neutral even though I immediately noticed something strange. Several creeks, fence lines, and road alignments shown on the map did not match the county survey I had in my truck. More importantly, there was no surveyor's certification anywhere on the document. It carried an HOA logo, revision dates, and landscaping notes, but none of the legal markings required on an official boundary survey. Patricia insisted this was the map the board had relied upon for years and that every maintenance decision had been made in good faith. I thanked her for the copy and left without arguing. 2 days later I received a letter from the county confirming that a formal boundary verification would take place in exactly 9 days because conflicting property information had been brought to their attention. The countdown had officially begun. That evening I scanned every page into my computer and compared them side by side. The differences were impossible to ignore, but one detail stood out above everything else. In the lower corner of the HOA map was a tiny revision number that had not appeared on an older neighborhood brochure I found online. Someone had updated that map recently, and I intended to find out exactly who had changed it and why. 3 days remained before the county would begin preparing for the boundary verification, and I knew waiting at home would accomplish nothing. If someone had recently changed the Homeowners Association map, there had to be a trail leading back to the original survey. My grandfather used to say that land never lied, only people did, and that thought pushed me toward the one person who might still remember what the property looked like before the subdivision was ever built. His name was Richard Lawson, a retired licensed surveyor who had worked throughout the county for more than 40 years before retiring. When I called, he recognized my family immediately and invited me to his workshop behind his house. Every wall was lined with rolled survey maps, faded aerial photographs, and shelves filled with field notebooks. After listening carefully, Richard asked me to spread both maps across his drafting table. He studied them quietly for several minutes without saying a word. Finally, he pointed to the Homeowners Association map and shook his head. He said the boundary itself looked familiar, but several reference points had disappeared. Old stone markers, creek intersections, and 2 iron survey pins that had always defined the eastern property line were completely missing. He explained that no licensed surveyor would remove those references from a legal boundary drawing because they were essential for locating the actual line on the ground. Then he opened one of his own archive tubes and carefully unrolled a survey he had completed nearly 20 years earlier. My heart nearly stopped. The original survey matched the certified county copy sitting in my truck almost perfectly. My family's timber was exactly where it had always been. Richard leaned back and quietly said that if the Homeowners Association was relying on its current map, then someone had either simplified it beyond recognition or altered it after the original work had been completed. Before I left, he mentioned something I had never heard before. Years before the subdivision was built, the developer had approached my grandfather about purchasing the timber tract to create a second neighborhood entrance and additional walking trails. My grandfather refused because he wanted to preserve the forest for future generations. According to Richard, the project moved forward without the land, forcing the subdivision to rely on a single entrance instead. That information completely changed my understanding of what had happened. This was no longer just a disagreement over property lines. There had once been a failed attempt to acquire the land legally. As I drove home, another surprise was waiting for me. My neighbor called and told me trucks had returned to the edge of the subdivision that morning, measuring the remaining tree line even after I had questioned the homeowners association. Instead of confronting anyone, I drove to the County Geographic Information Systems office and requested to compare the current digital parcel layer with the archived survey records. The technician agreed to schedule a review before the official boundary verification because conflicting information had already been reported. Just before leaving, she glanced back at her monitor and frowned. She quietly admitted that the digital property layer displayed on her screen did not perfectly match the scanned paper survey stored in the county archive. For the second time in 2 days, I was staring at two versions of the same land, and now even the county's own digital records appeared to be telling different stories. 5 days remained before the county boundary verification, and the closer the deadline came, the more confident Patricia Reynolds seemed to become. That confidence bothered me because people rarely doubled down unless they believed they had something protecting them. Instead of waiting for the county to answer every question, I decided to follow something much more difficult to argue with than maps. I would follow the timber itself. Every commercial logging operation leaves a paper trail because valuable lumber does not simply disappear. Early the next morning I drove to the largest sawmill within 50 miles of my property carrying photographs of the fresh stumps and a list of truck descriptions I had recorded on the day the trees disappeared. The manager greeted me politely but became noticeably more serious when I explained why I was there. He asked me to wait, while he reviewed recent delivery records. After nearly 20 minutes he returned holding several printed shipping receipts. He did not immediately hand them to me, but he confirmed that a large load of hardwood matching my description had been delivered only days earlier by a local contractor. Every bundle had been tagged, weighed, photographed, and entered into the mill's inventory system. He explained that mills documented everything because buyers demanded chain of custody records before purchasing lumber. I asked whether he could tell who claimed ownership of the logs when they arrived. He looked down at the paperwork for several seconds before quietly answering that the delivery documents identified the homeowners association as the legal owner of the timber. My stomach tightened. This was no misunderstanding between neighbors. Someone had signed official commercial paperwork declaring that my family's forest belonged to the association. The manager apologized and explained that company policy prevented him from releasing copies without a request from law enforcement or the county. But he assured me every document remained archived and could be produced if investigators asked. That was enough. I thanked him and drove directly to the county administration building. The boundary verification team had already opened a preliminary case because of the conflicting surveys. I met with the county property coordinator and explained what I had learned at the sawmill. When I mentioned the existence of signed ownership documents, the tone of the meeting changed immediately. The coordinator made several notes, and informed me that the investigation would now include commercial transaction records in addition to land surveys. She also contacted the county forestry office while I was still sitting there, requesting that one of their specialists join the upcoming site inspection. As I left the building, my phone rang. It was Michael Jensen from the county records office. He told me he had been reviewing historical requests connected to my property file after our earlier conversation. One request from several years before caught his attention because it included a reference number that no longer matched any document currently stored in the archive. He could not explain why the number existed without a corresponding file, but he believed something had been removed or relocated long before I arrived seeking records. That missing file became far more important than any map because official archives were not supposed to have unexplained gaps. As the sun began to set, I parked beside the remaining section of my timber and looked across the hillside where generations of trees had once stood. I no longer believed the changing maps were the biggest mystery. Somewhere inside the county archive, there appeared to be a missing record connected to my land, and if that document resurfaced before the boundary verification, it could change the entire case. 4 days remained before the county's boundary verification, and for the first time since this began, it felt like the investigation was moving faster than the rumors. Early that morning, Michael Jensen called again and asked whether I could come to the records office before opening hours. His voice was calm, but there was an urgency I had not heard before. When I arrived, he led me into a secure archive room where several old storage boxes sat on a large table. He explained that while searching for the missing reference number, another employee had discovered an unopened transfer box that had been misplaced during a records digitization project years earlier. Inside were engineering notes, correspondence, survey drafts, and property files dating back more than 20 years. We carefully worked through the folders one by one until Michael suddenly stopped and slid a worn envelope toward me. The front contained my grandfather's name along with the subdivision developer's company. My hands nearly froze as I opened it. Inside was a formal letter from the county planning department written years before construction of the neighborhood began. The letter clearly stated that the developer's request to purchase or obtain access through our timber property had been denied after my grandfather refused to sell. Even more important, the county reminded the developer that all future construction plans had to respect the existing private property boundary recorded in the official survey. I read the letter twice to make sure I had not misunderstood it. Richard Lawson had been telling the truth. There really had been an attempt to acquire our land legally before the subdivision existed. Michael then pulled another document from the same folder. It was an internal planning sketch showing 2 proposed neighborhood entrances. One entrance had been crossed out by hand with the words, "Private property not acquired," written across the page. That simple note completely changed the story. The homeowners association could not honestly claim the forest had always been common land because the original planning documents acknowledged exactly the opposite. Michael immediately scanned both documents into the county system and notified the property coordinator overseeing the investigation. Before I left, he quietly admitted something else. The archive box should have been indexed years earlier, but nobody could explain why it had remained separated from the main property file. Whether it was an administrative mistake or something else, no one could yet say. Later that afternoon, I received another update from the county. Because of the newly discovered records and the commercial timber transaction, the upcoming boundary verification would now include representatives from the Geographic Information Systems Office, the Forestry Department, and the County Attorney's Office. The review had grown far beyond a routine property inspection. As evening settled over my farm, I walked the remaining tree line and thought about my grandfather. He had protected this land decades before I inherited it, never imagining that an old letter buried inside a forgotten archive box would one day become the strongest evidence in defending it again. Just before I turned back toward the house, my phone vibrated with a new message from Michael. Another folder from the same archive box had just been opened, and this one contained correspondence sent directly to the Homeowners Association years ago. He had only read the first page, but he believed it might prove the board had been warned in writing long before a single tree was ever removed. 3 days remained before the county's official boundary verification, and by sunrise my driveway was already filling with vehicles carrying county seals instead of neighborhood logos. For the first time since the trees had disappeared, the investigation had moved beyond arguments and into evidence. Representatives from the Geographic Information Systems Office, the Forestry Department, the County Attorney's Office, and the Property Records Division met at the eastern boundary of my farm. Richard Lawson arrived as well, carrying the original survey he had shown me days earlier. Patricia Reynolds appeared with 2 members of the Homeowners Association board still holding the same laminated community map she had confidently presented to me before. Nobody raised their voice. Everyone understood that whatever happened over the next few hours would depend entirely on documents and measurements. The survey crew began locating the original iron pins described in my grandfather's recorded survey. One after another, each monument was found exactly where the certified records indicated it should be. Every measurement confirmed the same conclusion. The freshly cut timber had stood hundreds of feet inside my property line. The forestry specialist carefully documented every stump, recording species, diameter, estimated age, and approximate market value. I had expected the loss to be significant, but even he admitted the mature hardwood represented far greater value than anyone had originally estimated. While the field team completed their measurements, the Geographic Information Systems analysts compared the official parcel database with the archived paper survey and the Homeowners Association map. After nearly an hour, one analyst quietly explained that the county's historical paper records, field monuments, and certified survey all agreed with each other. Only the Homeowners Association map and one newer digital layer showed the altered boundary. That single statement changed the entire atmosphere. Patricia insisted her board had relied upon information provided years earlier, and had no reason to question its accuracy. The county attorney listened carefully before asking a simple question. Could anyone identify who created the revised boundary displayed on the association's map? No one at the table could answer. The silence lasted much longer than any argument could have. Then Michael Jensen arrived carrying a sealed archive folder. Inside was the additional correspondence he had mentioned the previous evening. The first letter immediately drew everyone's attention. It had been sent years before from the county planning department directly to the subdivision developer, with copies addressed to the future Homeowners Association Management Company. The letter clearly warned that the timber tract remained private property and that no maintenance, construction, or vegetation removal could occur beyond the approved subdivision boundary without written permission from the recorded owner. The county attorney asked everyone present to read the letter carefully before continuing the inspection. Patricia's expression changed for the first time since I had met her outside the clubhouse days earlier. She quietly admitted she had never seen that correspondence before. Whether that was true or not, nobody could yet determine. As the inspection concluded, the county attorney announced that all physical evidence now matched the archived legal records and that a formal administrative hearing would take place in 3 days to review every document, every survey, every commercial timber record, and every historical letter together. Just as everyone began packing their equipment, one Geographic Information Systems analyst called the group back to his laptop. He had examined the metadata attached to the altered digital parcel layer, and discovered it had not been imported from an old county survey as everyone assumed. The file had been created years later from an entirely different source, and the author information embedded inside the record had not yet been identified. 2 days remained before the administrative hearing, and I realized the case was no longer about convincing anyone that the timber belonged to my family. That question had already been answered by the surveys, the property markers, the forestry inspection, and the archived planning records. The real mystery had become something entirely different. Who created the altered digital boundary, and how had it remained in circulation for years without anyone questioning it? Early that morning I received a call from the County Geographic Information Systems analyst who had examined the metadata after the field inspection. He explained that they had successfully traced the revision history of the digital parcel layer. Contrary to everyone's assumption, the altered boundary had never been imported from the county's official cadastral database. Instead, it had been uploaded years earlier as an external planning reference during a neighborhood infrastructure update. That meant the inaccurate boundary had not replaced the official legal records. It had simply existed beside them, quietly influencing planning maps while never changing the certified property files. That discovery changed how the county viewed the entire investigation. Later that morning I met with Michael Jensen and Richard Lawson at the records office. Michael had organized every historical document into chronological order, while Richard compared each map against the original survey monuments. The timeline told a story none of us had fully understood before. First, the subdivision developer failed to purchase my grandfather's timber. Next, the county formally rejected any future access to the property. Years later, an unofficial planning map showing an expanded common area appeared during neighborhood updates. Finally, the Homeowners Association relied on that planning map when authorizing maintenance beyond its actual boundary. Richard quietly looked across the table and said something that stayed with me. He believed the evidence suggested years of accumulated assumptions rather than a single decision. Every new board may have trusted the previous board without ever verifying the original legal documents. That explanation sounded reasonable, but it still left one unanswered question. If the county had repeatedly warned the developer about the private property boundary, why had those warning letters never reached later association leadership? That afternoon, the county attorney's office shared copies of the correspondence with every member of the current homeowners association board before the hearing. Within hours, several residents contacted me directly. Some apologized for believing the timber belonged to the neighborhood, while others admitted they had always assumed the wooded area was privately owned because no walking trails had ever existed there. For the first time, public opinion inside the subdivision began shifting away from rumors and toward documented facts. Even Patricia called me late that afternoon. Her voice sounded completely different from our first conversation beside the clubhouse. She said she had spent the day reviewing old association files and could not find the county warning letters anywhere in the board archives. She insisted she would present every document her office still possessed during the hearing, regardless of whether it supported the association's position. I thanked her for saying that because the investigation had already grown larger than either of us. As evening approached, Michael sent me one final update before the courthouse closed. While reviewing archived correspondence indexes, another records employee had discovered a reference to a certified mailing receipt connected to one of the county warning letters. If that receipt could be located, it would not only prove the letter had been sent. It might also prove exactly who had signed for it many years before, only one day before the hearing was scheduled to begin. The morning of the administrative hearing arrived with a calm that felt almost unnatural after days of constant discoveries. As I walked into the county administration building carrying nothing more than a folder of certified records, I realized I no longer felt the need to convince anyone. The evidence had already begun speaking for itself. Around the conference table sat representatives from the county attorney's office, the Geographic Information Systems Division, the Forestry Department, the Property Records Office, Richard Lawson, Patricia Reynolds, members of the Homeowners Association Board, and the contractor who had supervised the timber removal. The hearing began with the county property coordinator presenting the certified survey, the recorded deed, the field measurements collected during the boundary verification, and the forestry assessment. Every document pointed to the same conclusion. The timber had always stood inside my family's recorded property. The county attorney then introduced the historical planning files recovered from the archive, including the rejected purchase request submitted decades earlier by the original subdivision developer. The room remained silent as the planning sketch showing the abandoned second entrance was projected onto the screen. Next came the correspondence that had transformed the investigation. Michael Jensen explained how the forgotten archive box had been located during the records search and how the county warning letters had been recovered together with the planning documents. Each letter clearly instructed the developer and future neighborhood management that the timber tract remained private property, and that no maintenance beyond the approved subdivision boundary could occur without written authorization from the recorded owner. Patricia acknowledged receiving copies only days earlier and confirmed that none of those letters existed in the current Homeowners Association files. The county attorney then shifted attention to the digital mapping issue. The Geographic Information Systems analyst demonstrated how the unofficial planning layer had been uploaded years after the original survey without replacing the certified parcel records. Side by side, the audience could see the official legal boundary and the later planning layer that mistakenly expanded the common area. The analyst emphasized that county ownership records had never changed. The inaccurate planning layer had simply been treated as though it represented legal property boundaries when it did not. The contractor then testified that his company had relied entirely on the Homeowners Association's map and written authorization before beginning work. He explained that every shipment delivered to the sawmill had been documented according to the ownership information provided by the association. The county attorney noted that this testimony matched the commercial records already collected from the mill. One final piece of evidence remained. Michael carefully placed the certified mailing receipt on the table. County archive staff had located it the previous afternoon. The receipt showed that the planning department's warning letter had been delivered successfully years earlier and signed for at the developer's administrative office before responsibility for the subdivision later transferred to the homeowners association. That discovery answered the oldest remaining mystery. The county could prove the warning had been sent and received, but there was no evidence the information had ever been preserved during later transitions in management. After reviewing every exhibit, the county attorney announced that the legal ownership of the timber was fully established, and that the county would formally correct every planning reference still displaying the inaccurate boundary. Administrative findings regarding responsibility for the unauthorized timber removal would be issued after the final written order was completed. As everyone gathered their documents, the property coordinator quietly informed the room that one additional historical review had been completed overnight. While correcting the planning records, county staff had discovered another outdated public map still being distributed through a different department, raising one final question about how many agencies had unknowingly relied on the same inaccurate planning layer before the correction became official. The final written order arrived exactly 1 week after the administrative hearing, and when I opened the envelope, I realized the outcome was even more important than I had imagined. The county did not simply confirm that my family owned the timber. It documented every step that had led to the mistake so that the same chain of errors could not happen again. The official findings stated that the certified deed, the original recorded survey, the recovered planning documents, the field inspection, the forestry assessment, and the archived correspondence all established that the removed timber had always been located entirely within my family's private property. The order also directed multiple county departments to replace outdated planning references with the certified legal boundary so future employees, contractors, and neighborhood associations would all rely on the same verified records. A few days later I returned to the records office where Michael Jensen handed me newly certified copies of the updated property maps. He smiled and said that this case had already changed how historical planning records would be reviewed before being incorporated into public mapping systems. Richard Lawson joined us that afternoon, and together we compared the updated records against the survey he had completed decades earlier. Every line now matched exactly. The old iron monuments, the creek crossings, the stone markers, and every recorded bearing once again agreed across every county department. Patricia Reynolds later requested a brief meeting at the edge of the subdivision. She thanked me for remaining patient throughout the investigation and acknowledged that her board had relied on planning documents without confirming them against the official county records. She explained that the homeowners association had already adopted a new policy requiring independent verification before authorizing any future work near private property boundaries. I appreciated hearing that because it meant something useful had come from an unfortunate situation. The contractor also contacted me personally. He explained that his company had revised its internal procedures and would now require certified ownership verification before accepting similar projects involving boundary areas. Even the sawmill manager called to let me know that every shipment connected to my timber had been fully documented and preserved as part of the completed administrative file. Although no document could replace trees that had taken generations to mature, seeing every organization improve its process gave me a sense that the loss had accomplished something meaningful beyond my own property. As autumn settled across the farm, I spent more time walking the remaining forest with a renewed appreciation for the land my grandfather had protected so carefully. The fresh stumps remained a reminder of what had happened, but they also reminded me that facts preserved in public records could outlast assumptions repeated for years. Looking across the hillside, I realized the greatest victory had never been about proving someone wrong. It had been about making certain the truth was permanently reflected in the records that future generations would inherit. The maps now matched the land, the county files matched the survey monuments, and every official document finally told the same story. My grandfather used to say that good fences make good neighbors, but after everything that happened, I learned that accurate records make something even more valuable. They protect people who may never meet each other, simply because the truth was written down correctly long before anyone needed to rely on it.